Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. In today's video, I'm going to show you guys another super OP'd Spiritborn build, which is Crushing Hands. The nice thing about this build is if you're using my previous build, the Quill Volley, this is going to use very similar equipment, so you're not going to need to go out there and find a whole bunch of new stuff. If you didn't use it, the nice thing about it is it's not going to be too gear intensive, meaning you should be able to find all of this stuff within about a day or two. So with that, I'm going to take you through the usual, which is the skill tree. We'll talk about the Paragon board. We'll dive into the Spirit Hall, and then we'll finish it up with equipment. And then once we're done with all of that, we'll also go ahead and put it up to a test by going up against Duriel in T4. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started and dive right in. Let's take a look at our skill tree. So we're going to start things off by putting 1 point into Thrash and then move it up to Enhanced Thrash. We're not using any basic skills in this, so it really doesn't matter which one you select. We just want to make sure we select something so that we're moving on down to our core skills, where we're going to be putting 5 skills into Crushing Hand. We're going to take it up to Enhanced Crushing Hand, and then finish this up with Rampant Crushing Hand. For passives, we're going to take 1 point into Vigorous, and then we're going to put 3 points into Balanced Exertion. And then we'll move on down to our focus skills, where we are going to put 1 rank into Vortex, take it up to Enhanced Vortex, and finish it up with Measured Vortex. While Vortex is not going to be on your bar, we are going to be triggering this by using Soar, so we still want to make sure that we take it up and enhance it all the way to Measured Vortex. Speaking of Soar, we are going to put 1 point into Soar. We'll take it up to Enhanced Soar, and then we'll finish this up with Replenishing Soar. For the passives, we're just going to put 1 point into Mirage so we can move up to Unrestrained Power, where for this guy, we're going to be putting 3 points into this. We also will be taking 1 point into Ravager, taking it down to Enhanced Ravager, and then finishing it up with Measured Ravager. On the left-hand side, we've got 1 point into Focal Point, and then we're going to put 3 points into Apex. Moving down the skill tree into our defensives. Defensives are going to be important with this build. We are going to take 1 point into Endurance, and then we're going to take 2 points into Perseverance. We also will be putting 5 points into Armored Hide. You can change this around if you'd like to. If you'd rather put more points into your ultimate, you can, but really I would recommend going with 5 points into Armored Hide, taking it up to Enhanced Armored Hide, and then finishing it up with Reinforced Armored Hide. We also will be using the counterattack passive, but we are not going to have this on our bar. So that means we're going to want to put 1 point into counterattack, take it down to counterattack enhancement, and then finish it up with reinforced counterattack. We also will be taking 1 point into Scourge, enhance Scourge with 1 point, and then finish it up with adaptable Scourge. And that'll be it for the defensives. Then we're going to move on down to our potency skills, where we will be putting 3 points into Resilient, and then 3 points into Dominant. And then lastly, for the potency skills, we are also going to be putting 3 points into Potent, and then 3 points in Furnace. And then moving on down to our ultimate skills, as usual, we're going to put 3 skills into Resolution, 3 skills into Spiritual Attunement, and then we're going to finish this up with 3 skills into Supremacy. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to power this up to 5 out of 5 skills, you can take a couple points off of your Armored Hide, but you really want to try to be as tanky as possible, especially if you're pushing higher level pits. And if you are doing Uber bosses, I would recommend just doing 1 point into Hunter, taking it up to Harmonious Hunter, and then finishing it up with Exalted Hunter. For key passives, we're going to take the same key passive as previously, which is going to be Prodigy's Tempo. And that will wrap it up for our skill tree. Now, taking a look at our Paragon board, a couple of differences here from what we're used to seeing on the Quill Volley build. So we're going to start things off on our first board, where we're going to be taking the Colossal Glyph here. And this is really going to be helping us with our Gorilla damage. And we are using a Gorilla skill now, so definitely important to have this. We'll move on up to our second board here, which is going to be the Revealing board. And we will be taking the Spirit Glyph here, and then jumping over into our third board on the left hand side, we're going to be taking the Vicious Shield, and we're going to be using the Outmatch Glyph. You may not necessarily need to max out on the strength around this guy right off the bat. You may want to fill out the rest of the board and come back to this at a later time, but at least make sure you have 25 out of the 25 strength so we can dip into the maximum capabilities of this glyph. But like I mentioned, you don't have to go all out and grab all of the strength glyphs right off the bat. You can do that a little bit later. And then moving on to the fourth board, for this guy, we're going to be using the sapping board, and then we're going to be taking the menagerist glyph for this guy. And same idea here. If you don't want to, you don't have to max out on dexterity all around, but at least have the 40 out of 40 so we can maximize on the glyph. And then lastly, for our fifth board, for this guy, we're going to be taking the infighter node, and we're going to be utilizing the hubris glyph for this. You can switch this around if you'd like to. There's some opportunity to change this glyph. However, I do find that having the 327% bonus to all magic nodes within range is helpful. It gives us some additional strength, vulnerable damage, and overall damage as well. If you'd rather use something else though, this one specifically is a little bit more optional than the other glyphs that we have. And then jumping into our spirit hall, we're going to be taking Jaguar for our primary. And then for the secondary spirit, we're going to be using Gorilla. And then let's talk about mercenary. So for the mercenary, we're going to use similar to what we were using on our Quill Volley build, which is going to be Rahir. And for this one, we want to make sure we take shield charge down to Rahir's guard, really so that we can get down to provoke, but specifically the one that's going to be helpful to us is going to be mocking lure, so we can do the additional 15% times increased damage to enemies taunted by Rahir. And then for your reinforcement, you're going to want to go with Varyana, and then for her, we're going to be selecting the Bloodthirst skill, where it's going to trigger every time we're using any skill in combat. And the Bloodthirst skill gives us additional attack speed up to 10%, which is really useful, again, especially for this build, which is highly dependent on attack speed. That's what allows us to maintain our shields. That's what allows us to be more tanky and also helps us with that damage output overall. Looking at our gear, the first thing we'll take a look at is going to be our weapon. So for this build, we're going to want to use the Rod of Kepaliki. And for this guy, masterworking, we're going to look at chance for core skills to hit twice. This is going to be crucial as that can double up on our damage. If you can't hit that, critical strike damage will do. Maximum resource will be fine as well, as we definitely need as much maximum resource as possible. For me, I was able to land on chance for core skills to hit twice. And like I said, that's really going to help us double up on that damage. For the runes, we're using Sir and K for this, which allows us to use the same non-channeled skill 3 times in order to invoke the Earthen Bulwark. That's going to mean we're going to have our Earthen Bulwark up pretty much 100% of the time, as we're going to be spamming non-channeling skills. Looking at our boots, we're using the duelist aspect for this guy. We really want to make sure that we're getting the dex on here, maximum life and armor. This build is a little bit tankier than the Quill Volley, so you'll notice that you probably won't be dying as much, but we still want to maintain as much maximum life as possible, and then including some armor in here as well, so we can reach that armor cap. For tempering, we're going to want barrier generation and movement speed. And then for masterworking, we want to try to masterwork maximum life, possibly 3 times if we can. If not, it's okay to get some additional barrier generation or movement speed in there, but ideally we want to try to hit all 3 on max life. Looking at our pants, similar idea here. We want to have as much max life as possible and armor as well. And then because our main skill, Crushing Hands, does count as a basic skill, we also want to try to throw some basic skills on here as well. For me, I was able to get a +4 on this, and this is when it's masterworked all the way up. Looking at the temperings, we're going to do similar idea here where we're getting barrier generation. We want as much of this as possible. And then we also want as many maximum resolve stacks as possible as well. Looking at our gloves, again, same gloves as what I was using before. We want max life. We want as much attack speed as possible on this. And then resource cost reduction. The one difference here is going to be the temperings. So we've tempered overpowered damage on here instead. And then we're maintaining vortex size as we had before. Now, looking at masterworking, we really want to try to either masterwork attack speed or max life. The more max life we have, the more tanky we're going to be. So ideally go for the max life, but if not, attack speed is going to be just as important as well. So either one of those two will work out just fine. Jumping into our armor. So one difference we have here from the previous build is that I am using the Shroud of False Death. This is going to increase our damage output quite a bit. If you have it, definitely want to make sure we're using this. And then for this, we want to try to masterwork maximum life. Damage on next attack is fine as well, but max life is what's going to continue to make us tanky. So try to go for all three on that guy. If you don't have this, it's fine. This build will still work without it. But if you don't have it, we're going to want to make sure that we're using the apprehension aspect, which once again, we were using on our previous build as well. And as far as the specific stats, we want to try to go for dex, maximum life, and armor, and then temper the barrier generation and resilient on here. So again, it's totally fine. You can definitely use this build without having mythic uniques. But if you do have it, that's great. If not, go for the apprehension aspect on your armor with these specific stats here. Next, we'll take a look at our helm. So for our helm, we want to go for the turbulence aspect. We are going to be using Soar with this build specifically. So with that being said, we want to make sure that every time we're casting Soar, it also casts Vortex as well. It makes it a lot easier to be able to hit all the enemies at once. While this specific build does not require that you're as precise as you are with Quill Volley, you still want to make sure that the enemies are within range. So using that Vortex to drive your enemies closer to you is going to increase your damage output and make it a little bit easier to go through your pit runs. When we look at our stats, we want to have Dex on here, as much max life as possible, and then max resource. And then we're going to temper barrier generation and max resolve stacks. If you can, you want to try to go for masterworking on max resolve stacks. The more of those you have, the more damage that you're going to be putting out. If you can't get it, then try to go for maximum life. But it is really important that we're getting as many max resolve stacks as possible with this build. When we look at our runes we're using for this, we are using Yule and Zal rune. This is going to allow us to get an additional 20% max life when we cast the skill with the cooldown 4 times. Majority of the skills that we have on our bar are going to have a cooldown, so this is going to be on pretty much 100% of the time as well. When we look at our amulet, we're going to be going with Banished Lord's Talisman. The overpower damage that we get from this is too great to not get it. And then as far as our stats, we want to try to make sure that we're masterworking attack speed or max life, just like everything else with this build. If you can get all 3 on max life, that is going to give you a nice boost. But if not, that attack speed is going to be just as important to make sure that we're putting out as much damage as we can as quickly as possible. For our ring, we've got 2 options we can go with here. For this one, we're going to be using Dex, Max Life, and Attack Speed, where we're going to be tempering resource cost reduction or overpower damage. And then we're using the Moonrise aspect with this to increase that attack speed and damage output. If you can, try to masterwork Max Life as many times as possible. That'll be super helpful. I just got this ring yesterday and I have not been able to masterwork it all the way up. And I've also run out of masterworking materials until I go back and do some hordes. But for now, we want to try to get at least these specific tempers and then go with Moonrise. If you want to use Mystic Circle instead with this build, which is very possible to do because our damage output with Crushing Hands is going to be considered a Jaguar skill. So Mystic Circle is still possible to use with this. That is absolutely fine. If you do that, then you're going to want to make sure that you're tempering in Mystic Circle instead of overpower damage. So again, totally fine. You can go either way. I know some people don't really want to use Mystic Circle because they're just not quite too sure how it works, or maybe you just don't like it. Whatever the case is, it is not necessary, but it is an option for you to go with that. Like I said, if you don't want to go with Mystic Circle, then go ahead and go with the Moonrise aspect, and then you'll just temper overpower damage instead. And then lastly, for our equipment, we've got the Ring of the Midnight Sun, similar to what we had on our previous build as well. For this guy, we want to try to get a GA on Dex if possible, and then masterwork the Dex as well. If not, you can masterwork Crit Strike Chance or Mirage is also fine, entirely up to you. We've got a couple of options. So that's it for the gear. As far as the gems that we're using here, I would recommend going with Barrier Generation, which is going to be the Amethyst for your armor, and then same thing for your pants. And then for our amulet and rings, we want to go with diamonds so that we can get a little bit more resistances. As you can see with the equipment we have on right now, we're already at the armor cap and actually surpassed it by a little bit. So we don't need to put any type of skulls in there. But if you're not meeting that armor cap and if your resistances are looking a little bit better than mine, then you can swap those out as you see fit. But if we look at the stats here, most of my resistances are really not quite at that maximum, and that's fine because we have so much barrier generation and because we are going to be proccing Earthen Bulwark and also the additional max life constantly. You really don't need this. But if you're finding that you are still squishy, like I said, you can kind of move around your gems that you're using in your amulets and your ring and swap those out depending on what gear you're currently using. Alrighty, so we went through our skills, we took a look at our Paragon board, Mercenary, Spirit Hall, and we also took a look at the equipment. With that being said, it's time to put this build to the test. So we're going to test this out by going over to Duriel and see how quickly we can take Duriel down. As you can see, we're currently in T4. So let's go ahead and make our way over there. All right, so we've made our way over to Duriel. So we're going to start off with Soar, jump into Hunter, and then activate our defensives. And should be able to take him down within a couple of seconds, so really, really quick. On top of that, you'll notice that a majority of the hits that we do against this guy, or basically any enemies, are going to be in the billions. So you should see a lot of bees, so a lot of damage output with this specific build. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. I also would love to hear what you guys think about this build and any of the previous builds. And then if you have any requests for a build that you'd like to see, don't forget to comment that below as well. And I can go ahead and give that a shot for you. With that, that's all I've got for today. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Until next time, Wanderers.